On January 29, 1943, an SS officer named Bischoff sat at his desk in Auschwitz and made a mistake. Not a moral mistake. He had long since stopped making those. A clerical one. In a letter addressed to SS Oberfuhrer Hans Kammler regarding the construction progress of Crematorium II at Birkenau, Bischoff referred to the basement morgue as a Vergasungskeller, a gassing cellar. The word was underlined, not for emphasis, for correction. At the top of the document, someone scrawled a note. SS Untersturmführer Kirchneck should be informed. Informed of what? Not that people were being gassed in that cellar. Everyone knew that. Kirchneck needed to be informed that he should never, under any circumstances, call it that in writing. That one-word correction on a single internal memo in a death camp tells you more about the Nazi regime than 1,000 speeches. Because the Third Reich did not merely kill millions of people. It developed, enforced, and institutionalized an entire language to ensure that the killing could be discussed, coordinated, budgeted, scheduled, and implemented across dozens of government agencies, military branches, and corporate partners, without anyone ever having to write, speak, or hear the word kill. The system had a name. It was called Sprachregelung, literally, language regulation, speech code. And it was not optional. It was policy. The practice did not begin with the Jews. It began with the disabled. In 1939, Hitler signed a backdated order, backdated to September 1st, the day the war began, so it could be framed as a wartime necessity, authorizing what the regime called Gnadentod, mercy, death. The program was designated Action T4, named after the address of its administrative headquarters at Tiergartenstraße 4 in Berlin. Under this program, doctors and nurses in psychiatric institutions across Germany were instructed to identify patients with incurable conditions and submit their files for review. The files were sent to panels of physicians who marked each one with a red plus sign, death, or a blue minus sign, life. No patient was examined in person. The decision was made entirely on paper, and the language that surrounded every step of the process was constructed to disguise what was happening. Babies born with birth defects were catalogued so they could be helped. Children with disabilities were sent for special care. When families received death certificates, if they received them at all, the cause was listed as pneumonia, heart failure, or natural causes. The killing centers themselves were designated as Heilanstalten, healing institutions. Between 1939 and 1945, Action T4 and its successor programs murdered an estimated 250 to 300 people. The method evolved from lethal injection to gassing. 6 specially equipped installations used carbon monoxide chambers disguised as shower rooms. The word shower entered the vocabulary of extermination for the first time here, years before Auschwitz. And when public pressure forced Hitler to officially halt the program in August 1941, after churches, particularly Bishop Clemens von Galen, spoke out, the killings did not stop. They simply went deeper underground. The language became more careful. The euphemisms became more refined. And the infrastructure, the gas chambers, the bureaucratic pipelines, the paperwork of death, was transferred directly to the emerging program for the extermination of European Jews. By mid-1941, the Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units operating behind the advancing German front in the Soviet Union, were shooting thousands of Jews daily. Their reports, unlike later documents, were sometimes startlingly direct. The Jäger report, submitted by SS Standartenführer Karl Jäger on December 1, 1941, is a 5-page single-spaced document listing 346 people executed by Einsatzkommando 3 in Lithuania between July and November of that year. The entries are organized by date, location, and category: Jews, Jewesses, Jewish children. The numbers are precise. September 12th, Vilna, 993. Jews, 1. 670 Jewesses, 771 Jewish children. October 29th, Kaunas, Fort 9, 2. 007 Jews, 2. 920 Jewesses, 4. 273 Jewish children. The language is clinical, not euphemistic, because the Einsatzgruppen reported to a narrow chain of command within the SS and SD, where explicitness was tolerated, even expected. But as the killing expanded from field operations to industrial-scale extermination, requiring the coordination of railways, foreign ministries, finance departments, justice systems, and occupied governments across an entire continent, the language could no longer be direct. Too many people had to be involved. Too many documents had to circulate. Too many agencies had to cooperate. And so the Sprachregelung tightened. As Hannah Arendt later wrote, analyzing the rigid language rules that governed all correspondence related to the genocide. Except in the reports from the Einsatzgruppen, it became rare to find documents using words like extermination, liquidation, or killing. The prescribed code words were final solution, evacuation, and special treatment. The first meant genocide. The second meant deportation to death camps. The third meant execution. On January 20th, 1942, 15 senior officials of the Nazi government and the SS gathered at a villa on the shores of Lake Wannsee in southwestern Berlin. They had been invited by Reinhard Heydrich, chief of the Reich Security Main Office, to discuss what the invitation note described as the final solution to the Jewish question. The meeting included breakfast. It lasted approximately 90 minutes. No one at the table objected to the plan. The plan itself, the systematic deportation and murder of an estimated 11 million Jews across Europe, was already underway. The purpose of the conference was not to decide. It was to coordinate, to establish the SS as the lead agency, to secure the bureaucratic cooperation of every relevant ministry: Interior, Justice, Foreign Affairs, the Office of the Governor-General of Poland, the Ministry for the Occupied Eastern Territories, the Office of the Four-Year Plan. And to do all of this through language that made genocide sound like administration. A stenographer took notes. Adolf Eichmann, head of the Department for Jewish Affairs within the Reich Security Main Office, revised the transcript into a formal protocol. 30 copies were prepared and distributed to all participants. 29 were destroyed after the war, as their holders tried to cover their tracks. The single surviving copy, number 16, belonged to Martin Luther, an undersecretary in the German Foreign Office. It was discovered by American prosecutor Robert Kempner in 1947, buried in captured foreign ministry files. The protocol is 15 pages long. It describes the murder of 11 million people without using the word murder once. Jews are to be evacuated to the east. In the course of this evacuation, they are to be allocated for labor, and through natural diminution, meaning death from exhaustion, starvation, and disease, their numbers will be reduced. Those who survive, described as the strongest, who might form the nucleus of a Jewish revival, are to be treated accordingly. The phrase is never defined. It did not need to be. Every man in the room understood it meant execution. They had been speaking this language for years. At his trial in Jerusalem in 1961, Eichmann was asked about the protocol. He confirmed that the words on the page were not the words the participants had used. The men at Wannsee, he testified, spoke in blunt terms, with no mincing of words. They spoke openly about killing. It was Eichmann's job to translate their directness into what he called office language. He removed what he described as vulgarisms and replaced them with approved formulations. The protocol that survived, the one document that proves continental-scale coordination of genocide among the highest levels of the German government, is, in Eichmann's own words, a sanitized version of a conversation about mass murder that was even more explicit than the already horrifying text suggests. This is the central mechanism of the Sprachregelung. The language was not designed to prevent knowledge. It was designed to prevent articulation. Every participant at Wannsee knew what was being discussed. Every secretary who typed a deportation order knew what evacuation to the east meant. Every railway official who scheduled a transport to Treblinka knew those trains were not carrying settlers. The historian Robert Jan van Pelt, analyzing the Bischoff letter from Auschwitz and its panicked correction of the word Vergassungskeller, concluded that in using euphemisms like special action and special treatment in place of extermination and killing, the first Holocaust deniers were the Nazis themselves. Not because they did not know what they were doing, but because they were constructing in real time a documentary record designed to deny what they knew perfectly well. And this is where two extraordinary witnesses enter the story. Not soldiers, not generals, not prosecutors, philologists, scholars of language who understood, with a precision born of professional training, that what was happening to words was inseparable from what was happening to people. The first was Victor Klemperer. Born in 1881, the son of a rabbi, Klemperer converted to Protestantism and became a professor of Romance literature at the Technical University of Dresden. In 1935, he was stripped of his academic position under the so-called Aryan Clause. He was not deported because he was married to Eva Klemperer, who was classified as Aryan and refused to divorce him. For the next 10 years, Klemperer lived in a series of Judenhäuser, buildings designated for Jews in mixed marriages, worked in a factory, was forbidden from using libraries, owning books, or listening to the radio. He was harassed by the Gestapo. He expected repeatedly to die. What kept him alive, intellectually, psychologically, was a project. He began to document. With the rigor of a trained philologist, every change in the German language under the Nazi regime. Every new word. Every old word given a new meaning. Every adjective weaponized. Every noun hollowed out. Every verb bent to serve the ideology. He called his project LTI, Lingua Tertii Imperi, the language of the Third Reich. The abbreviation itself was a parody. The Nazis loved Latin-sounding abbreviations for their organizations, and Klemperer gave their language the same treatment. He wrote his observations in his diary. Eva smuggled the pages out of the Judenhaus and hid them with a friend, a doctor, who kept them until the war ended. Klemperer survived the firebombing of Dresden on February 13, 1945. In the chaos, he tore the yellow star from his coat and walked out of the burning city. He published LTI in 1947. The book is not a dictionary, it is a diagnosis. Klemperer tracked how the Nazis did not invent many new words. They colonized existing ones. The word fanatisch, which in standard German carried strongly negative connotations of irrationality and excess, was inverted under the Third Reich into the highest compliment. To be fanatical in one's devotion to the Führer was to be the ideal citizen. The word Volk, meaning people, was embedded into dozens of compound nouns. Volksgemeinschaft, Volkswagen, Volkssturm, each one carrying the implication that true belonging required racial purity. The superlative became the default mode of official communication. Every victory was unprecedented, every sacrifice historic, every challenge existential. Klemperer noted that this inflation of language had a dulling effect. It trained people to stop thinking critically about what words actually meant. And that was the point. He also documented something subtler and, in its way, more devastating. He observed that LTI, the language of the Third Reich, did not remain confined to speeches and official documents. It seeped into everyday conversation. Jews in the Judenhäuser used it. His own friends used it. People who despised the regime found themselves reaching for its vocabulary because no other words were available. The language did not just describe reality. It shaped the categories through which reality could be perceived. As Klemperer wrote, "It is not only Nazi actions that have to vanish, but also the Nazi cast of mind, the typical Nazi way of thinking, and its breeding ground, the language of Nazism." The second witness was Nachman Blumenthal. Born in 1902 in Borschtów, in what was then Galicia, Blumenthal studied literature at the University of Warsaw, specializing in metaphor. His master's thesis was titled On Metaphor. Before the war, he published literary criticism in Yiddish newspapers and magazines across Poland. When the German occupation began, Blumenthal managed to escape to the Soviet Union. His first wife, Maria, and their 3-year-old son Ariel stayed behind. They tried to pass as Catholics. They were betrayed by their neighbors and handed over to the Nazis. Both were murdered on June 7, 1943, in Wielopole-Skrzyńskie. In 1944, Blumenthal returned to Poland. With a group of historians, ethnographers, and linguists, he founded the Central Jewish Historical Commission. Over 3 years, they transcribed 3 Nuremberg survivor testimonies. They scavenged Nazi paperwork from abandoned Gestapo offices. They collected fragments of daily life from the ghettos, songs, poems, jokes, children's schoolwork, administrative documents. And Blumenthal, the man who had devoted his career to the study of metaphor, turned that expertise to the most obscene metaphors ever constructed. The Nazi euphemisms that had renamed his son's murder as resettlement. In 1947, the same year Klemperer published LTI, Blumenthal published the first volume of Słowa niewinne, Innocent Words. It was designed as a reverse engineering dictionary. Each entry took a Nazi euphemism and decoded it, revealing the reality the word was designed to conceal. Abförderung, dispatching, meaning killing. Action, meaning a mass murder operation. Sonderbehandlung, special treatment, meaning execution. Umsiedlung, resettlement, meaning deportation to a death camp. The dictionary covered letters A through I. Blumenthal planned a second volume. He never completed it. His papers, now held at the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research in New York, show that the project expanded continuously as he gained access to newly opened Nazi archives. There was always more language to decode. There were always more innocent words that had been made to carry the weight of genocide. What Blumenthal understood, from his training as a scholar of metaphor, was that Nazi euphemisms were not simple substitutions, swapping a harsh word for a gentle one. They were a systematic restructuring of meaning. When the regime called gas chambers showers, it was not merely lying. It was constructing a parallel reality in which the infrastructure of death looked, on paper, like infrastructure of hygiene. When it called deportation, evacuation, it imported the connotations of rescue, of moving people out of danger, and grafted them onto the act of sending people to their deaths. The genius and the horror of the system was that it did not require belief. No one needed to believe that the gas chambers were actually showers. The euphemism functioned not by deceiving its users, but by providing them with a vocabulary that allowed participation without confrontation. You could schedule a transport, you could allocate resources for special treatment, you could file a report on evacuation numbers, and at no point in any of these acts did you have to say, hear, write, or read the words, "I am helping to murder people." This is what Himmler's Posen speeches proved. On October 4, 1943, the head of the SS stood before 92 senior SS officers in the town hall of Posen, today Poznan, in Poland, and delivered a 3-hour address. The speech was transcribed by a stenographer and recorded on acetate discs. Both the transcription and a portion of the audio recording survived the war and were captured by American forces. They are now held in the U.S. National Archives. Document PS 1919 was entered into evidence at the Nuremberg trials. For most of the speech, Himmler used standard Nazi vocabulary. He spoke of the war, of the Waffen-SS, of organizational matters. And then he arrived at what he called a very difficult topic. He told his audience that among themselves, it should be spoken of quite openly for once, though they would never speak of it in public. And in the next sentence, something extraordinary happened. Himmler began with the official euphemism. He referred to the evacuation of the Jews, Evacuierung. Then he paused, and then he said a word that was never supposed to appear in any official Nazi document, speech, or communication. Ausrottung, extermination, the extermination of the Jewish people. The audio recording captures the moment. Historians who have analyzed the tape note that Himmler hesitated in the middle of the word Ausschaltung, elimination, before correcting himself and using the more explicit Ausrottung, extermination. It is, in the judgment of multiple scholars, a moment of real-time code switching. Himmler's mental check of whether, in this particular room, with this particular audience, the euphemism could be dropped. He decided it could. And what followed was the most explicit acknowledgement of genocide by any senior Nazi official during the war. He told his officers that every party comrade could easily say that the Jewish people would be exterminated. That was in the program. But then each of them encountered individual Jews they considered exceptions. He spoke of the difficulty of watching hundreds, thousands of corpses lying together. He praised his men for having endured this and for having remained decent, anständig. He called the extermination of the Jewish people an unwritten and never-to-be-written chapter of glory in German history. 2 days later, on October 6th, he repeated and expanded these statements to a different audience of Gauleiter and government officials. In this second speech, he went further. He explained that the decision had been made to exterminate not only Jewish men, but also women and children, so that no avengers could grow up to threaten future generations of Germans. The Posen speeches are the proof that the Sprachregelung was not about ignorance. Every officer in that room had been using euphemisms for years. They had written reports about special treatment. They had coordinated evacuations. They had managed the logistics of resettlement. And here was the head of the SS telling them, in plain German, what all of those words actually meant, and every man in the room already knew. The euphemisms had never been a wall between the perpetrators and the truth. They had been a door that allowed each person to walk through the act of genocide without ever having to look directly at what they were doing. Himmler, at Posen, simply held the door open and forced them to look. After the war, the language did not disappear as cleanly as the regime. Klemperer, living in East Germany, noticed fragments of LTI surfacing in the speeches of the new anti-fascist officials. The same mechanistic vocabulary, the same calls for Kämpferisch democracy, the same inflation of commitment. The words had outlived the ideology. The patterns had embedded themselves in the way German officials spoke, wrote, and thought. When Klemperer published LTI, he included a metaphor that remains one of the most cited passages in Holocaust studies. If a piece of cutlery belonging to Orthodox Jews has become ritually unclean, they purify it by burying it in the earth. Many words in common usage during the Nazi period, he wrote, should be committed to a mass grave for a very long time. Some forever. But Klemperer also noted one exception. One word that vanished entirely from German public life after 1945. The word was fanatisch. The Nazis had used it as their highest compliment for 12 years. After the collapse of the regime, it disappeared overnight. From this, Klemperer drew a devastating conclusion. Either consciously or subconsciously, people had remained aware of the real meaning all along. For 12 years, a word denoting irrationality and excess had been used to describe the highest virtue. And the moment the regime fell, Everyone immediately stopped using it, proving that they had always known what it really meant. Nachman Blumenthal immigrated to Israel in 1950. He continued his archival work, including at Yad Vashem. He never completed the second volume of Innocent Words, but his papers reveal something that no dictionary could contain. Among the thousands of Nazi documents, testimonies, and linguistic note cards, researchers recently discovered his handwritten notes about the murder of his wife Maria and son Ariel. The man who had spent years decoding the language of mass murder had also, in quiet handwriting, been documenting the evidence of his own family's destruction. The names of the Polish neighbors who betrayed them, the details of the day, the mechanism of the killing. The scholar of euphemism had no euphemisms for this. He wrote it in plain words. On the first page of the Wannsee Protocol, there is a distribution list, 30 copies, one for each participant and key official. 29 men destroyed their copies. One did not. And from that single surviving document, 15 pages of office language, drafted by a man who admitted he replaced the truth with approved formulations, we know exactly what they discussed over breakfast that January morning. The words on the page do not say murder. They say evacuation, labor allocation, natural diminution, treated accordingly. But if you have read the Bischoff letter, the Eichmann testimony, the Posen recordings, the Klemperer diaries, and the Blumenthal dictionary, you understand that every single one of those innocent words was carrying a body. And the men who wrote them, read them, filed them, and forwarded them to the next desk knew it. They just never had to say it out loud. Until Posen. Until Himmler paused in the middle of a word, decided his audience could handle the truth they had been living with for years, and spoke the unspeakable. And then he said something else, something the euphemisms were specifically designed to prevent. He said, "We shall never speak of it in public." The language rules existed in the end for precisely this reason. Not to hide the genocide from the perpetrators, but to ensure that the perpetrators could continue to speak in public, could continue to function as officials, bureaucrats, professionals, neighbors, fathers, while privately participating in the largest organized murder in human history. The euphemism was not a mask over the truth. It was a mirror that showed each participant a version of themselves they could live with. Victor Klemperer, the professor who survived by observing language from inside the machinery of persecution, left one final observation. The most powerful effect of the Nazi language, he concluded, was not what it said. It was what it made unsayable. When every available word for a thing has been replaced by a word that means something else, the thing itself begins to disappear. Not from reality, but from the capacity to think about it clearly. The Nazis did not just kill people. They killed the words that would have allowed their own society to understand what was happening. And by the time the words were recovered, by Klemperer in Dresden, by Blumenthal in the ashes of Poland, by prosecutors at Nuremberg, millions of people had already been processed, evacuated, treated, and resolved. In that single correction on the Bischoff letter, the underlined word, the scrawled reprimand, the insistence that Kirchneck be told never to call the gas chamber a gas chamber, the entire system is visible. The building existed. The gas existed. The people who were forced into it existed. The only thing that was not allowed to exist was the word for what was happening. And that prohibition, that tiny, bureaucratic, furious correction on a single page in a single camp, was the language rule that made a continent of murder possible.